Ladies and gentlemen, we're ready to begin the third session of this morning's Gateway of India Dialogue. The topic for this Dialogue 3 at the Gateway House Dialogue this morning is Strategic Financing for Effective Economic Diplomacy. Moderating, Director of Research and Geoeconomics Fellow, Gateway House, Mr. Akshay Mathur. Over to you, Akshay.
Okay, good morning to you again. The objective of this session is to discuss and examine the use of finance as an instrument of economic diplomacy. Now, our mandate at Gateway House, as you have learned since in yesterday's opening remarks and through our work, is that we focus on issues of international economic relations, of course, popularly known in short form as economic diplomacy. At the core of the Gateway House study area is a program called Geoeconomics, where we study international business, finance, international trade, and international economics. But at Gateway House, we also extend the study of economic relations to other dimensions like energy markets and the role that energy markets and price discovery plays. We extend it to the role of military-industrial complex and what is the role of producing and manufacturing defense equipment. We also study the impact of socio-economic developments on international relations. So, of course, economic diplomacy has many dimensions. Our objective in discussing economic diplomacy has been furthered and popularized now by what Prime Minister Modi is doing. Prime Minister Modi's government has put economics and commerce at the center of foreign policy. You can see the effort that is being put in attracting finance, in negotiating trade agreements. I think you saw from Foreign Secretary's speech last night on how important it is to align business and strategic objectives for our national development. And most of the focus, though, in the popular domain has remained on trade and FDI. There are other dimensions of economic relations and economic diplomacy. For instance, outward FDI. How do countries invest in other countries? How do companies invest in other countries? Our energy sector has played a big role in seeking and investing in energy assets abroad. We also have aid and how countries finance economic development in foreign countries. We have sovereign wealth funds which have doubled in the last 10 years and now hold $5 trillion in assets. And of course, we have the multilateral banks and Exim banks that support countries' own national sovereign economic diplomacy objectives. So for that, we have a very good panel here today. Dr. Cham, representing the Turkish International Cooperation and Development Agency. I think most of you will be surprised to know that it is one of the world's largest aid agencies and working across 120 countries. Of course, after that, we have our own Mr. David Rasquinha, representing the Exim Bank of India, one of the sharpest and instruments of economic diplomacy for the country, holding a loan portfolio of more than $12 billion. And I hope you will tell us how we've attained that in the last few years. Mr. Kapil Kapoor, representing the African Development Bank. He's also been with the World Bank before, done a lot of work in securing finances for all kinds of global needs and development finance needs. And he's also part of a group called the Heads of Multilateral Development Banks, where the seven multilateral development banks meet, the heads of seven banks meet, accounting for a total of $400 billion in capital. So you're at least representing a lot of money here, Kapil. Of course, after that is Mark Calabria. He dedicates his life to studying financial regulation, and but he's also worked with the US Congress. And of course, Kundnani, who is going to tell us how geopolitics impacts economic diplomacy. But before we start, the panel is going to flow like this. We'll have 4 to 5 minutes by each participant. I have a lead-in question, and then we'll engage in a panel discussion. In the meantime, please, as is the practice in the last session, please give your questions to the moderator envoys, Elvira and Kunal, who are standing here on my right. But I'd like to start with Dr. Cham. Dr. Cham, please tell us, how did Turkey get to where it is? How did your aid agency become so effective and so popular? And I think if I have my numbers right, it is now in the club of the largest aid agencies in the world, along with US, UK, Germany, and Japan. That's a very rich club of countries, right? So how did we get here?
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for inviting us for such an important event. Thank you for Gateway House, and good morning to everybody here. I would like to give a brief figures. Now a number of our offices in the world is 53 as TİKA, and we are developing projects more than in 150 countries. And we became the world's most generous country in the recent 2 years in the humanitarian assistance. And we have also developed thousands of projects each year. So in one part, we are very happy about it, the figures. If it is necessary, we may be proud of these figures, but also in the other part, we have to think about it. We are not the number one, the world's first economy in the world. We are only 70th economy in G20, 6th economy in Europe. But why we are becoming the number one in many parts of the humanitarian assistance and development assistance? So there are many reasons. After the 2011, when the issues started related with the Arab Spring and many difficulties in the region, one was the reason that we have started to take more action. The second thing is also the difficulties like drought and famine in Africa and many parts. So after year 2010, our foreign assistance, the ODA figures, suddenly jumped. And we passed $1 billion level after year 2011. And now, last year, we have reached to $4 billion. It's geographically increasing. So this is a question to be asked. So this is not a kind of strategy, not a kind of planning, not make any kind of expectation. We have to think about the issue of thinking about human being. So we have been very mechanized, making calculations, using too much figures, making too much meetings, statistical figures. So everything is coming too much in front of us. Of course, we need every kind of institutions, every kind of toolkits, banking systems, and every kind of supporting mechanisms. But on the top, we have to put our emotions. So I would like to give the resemblance between the Indian people and Turkish people. 100 years ago, I would like to mention that because yesterday I have visited the Khilafat House of Bombay, which 100 years ago, the Indian people, without having any kind of differentiation of culture, religion, or ethnic background, all the Indian people with the governance of Gandhi, they have supported my nation, my country, and they have contributed very important amount of money for the establishment of new Republic of Turkey. Therefore, they were not expecting anything from Turkey. They didn't make any kind of calculation. If I spend $1 amount of foreign assistance, how much I'm going to gain? This was not the question. But nowadays, in one part we are giving many countries. On the other hand, we are taking too much. Now we have 3 million of people of refugees came from Syria. And we are still trying to protect our intention to use our open gate strategy for our borders. Whenever a country indirectly or directly causes the bombings in the cities, or any kind of radical movements, or any kind of terror attacks happened in those places, thousands of people are coming to our city. And we are not making any kind of expectation from those people, just looking them as guests from outside, from our neighbors. So we have to discuss about the feelings. We have to put the human being, the kids, the women, disabled people, and disadvantaged people at the center, and then think about it. Otherwise, we had many important meetings in Istanbul. Last month, we had the first ever organized meeting of human assistance, humanitarian summit happened. We have also hosted the summit of LDCs. And we had also, we were the presidents of the G20 and also the presidents of OIC is now in Turkey. In all cases, we are just trying to make people aware of understanding what is going on in the world. The many crises are coming. The governance of the states are day by day getting weaker. Illegal organizations are getting stronger. So no one is trying to spend their billions or millions in their banks. Billions and millions of money are placed in the banks of Western countries, not including the Islamic countries, rich countries. So everybody has to sit and think about the question, what is going on in the world? Because if we do not take necessary action, we will be facing worse problems in the future, which we should not leave these problems to our next generations. So I would like to stop for this part. Thank you.
David, Exim Bank has been growing in scale and size. $12 billion portfolio, 60 plus countries, 200 people, 300 people. How are you doing it?
Thanks, Akshay. Actually, the numbers are a little more. It's probably, you've not seen our latest annual report, it's probably around $16 billion and $18 billion on size and 300 people. If you look at Exim banks around the world, and Exim India is no exception, they're really crisis responses. If you see the ECGD, it's not really an Exim bank, but it was in 1990, soon after the First World War. The US Exim Bank was in 1931, with the Great Depression pretty much going on. The Exim banks of Japan and Korea followed the Second World War and the Korean War. So an Exim bank, by definition, is a non-market response to a perceived market failure. The same was in the case of Exim Bank of India in '82. You may remember, I'm probably one of the oldest people in the room here, so I can safely say that this was following the oil price shocks, which had made a huge impact on Indian project exports. So for that reason, $16 billion, is it a big amount? No, it's not a big amount. Should it become a bigger amount? I'm not quite sure. If Exim Bank were to grow too much beyond that level, I would frankly get a little worried, because then it means that market failure has persisted to a point where the non-market intervention is now playing too large a role. So I would see Exim Bank as holding position in this area, being a policy instrument of the government of India in terms of the lines of credit, in terms of bilateral cooperation, in terms of the other overseas assistance, the OOA, as opposed to official development assistance. I would see us growing something like the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, which started its existence as the J-Exim, but has evolved over a period of time to be Japan's instrument along with JICA for international cooperation, international development assistance. Today already, this form of development assistance is perhaps around 38% of my loan portfolio. I see that growing in the years to come till it reaches closer to 45, maybe 50%, so that there would be a balance between the commercial side of the business and the government-aided side of the business. But ultimately, as the instrument of the government of India, our focus would be on India's economic diplomacy, and I suspect that's why you've got us here on this panel.
Thank you very much. My lead-in question to you, Kapil, is, you've worked with World Bank and now with African Development Bank, but I suppose the most interesting thing is that a lot of your time you've dedicated in these two institutions securing and raising financing from public funds, private sources, governments. Please tell us your experience on how you have done that and the policies that you've designed for that.
Okay, thanks very much, Akshay, and thank you very much to Gateway House for inviting me here. I mean, the first point that I would like to make is this is a tremendously exciting time to be working on international development, international finance. And the reason I say that is because last year, as all of you know, in September, the world reached agreement on a new set of sustainable development goals, which were very, very development-oriented. Now, they came with a huge challenge, right? The challenge essentially is, how do governments, multilateral agencies, bilateral agencies, and the private sector come together to finance roughly $5 trillion, and I'm talking about trillion rather than billions, right, of development expenditure that is actually needed. And frankly, no one knows, because the orders of magnitude are extremely large. And so when you mention that, I'm part of this group among the multilateral development bank heads, this is an issue that's really occupying us. What is the role that the World Bank, that the Asian Development Bank, that the African Development Bank, EBRD can do collectively to bring in private finance? Because the feeling is that it is not aid that's going to bridge this gap. It is not government finance alone and tax revenues alone, but it's actually going to work if the private sector can be attracted in. I was interested to hear that yesterday you had a session of the T20. One of the things that we are doing, and I'm working with Paul Collier with the G20, is what kind of innovative risk mitigation instruments can the multilateral development banks put into place so that the private sector feels much more comfortable about investing in infrastructure. Now, so on the one hand, there's a lot of talk about collaboration, partnership, coming together. And yet I was struck by the discussion in the earlier session, because the fact of the matter is that the international financial system is actually pretty fragmented. If you look at the international institutions that were created after World War II and the Cold War, I mean, the shareholding structure is dominated very much by the G7 countries, who effectively exercise a veto. I mean, a lot of times you talk about the shareholding in the IMF, people don't even think about the regional development banks like the Asian Bank and the African Development Bank, which actually intermediate billions of dollars. But I mean, at the African Development Bank, India has a 0.26% share. India is represented on the African Development Board by the Nordic countries. China is represented by Canada. So, I mean, the fact of the matter is that the world has moved on, but the governance of these international financial institutions hasn't changed. Now, why do I make this point? I'm making this point because effectively, what the countries then do on our boards is exercise a kind of moral suasion, if not an outright veto, on issues of real importance when it comes to development. And because you mentioned the energy sector, let me just give you an example from the African context on the energy sector. Right now, we're in the middle of a debate. The size of the energy investments needed in Africa is between 60 and 90 billion dollars a year. Right now, about 30% of Africa's population has access to energy. Now, when the agreement on COP21 was reached last year, every African country said, yes, we will go on and move towards renewables, but right now, coal is very, very important to us. We cannot meet the baseload requirements without coal. But you have a situation where on our board today, we are not able to finance any energy project that is coal-based. So what does this mean? This means that we are talking about meeting the sustainable development goals on the one hand, all this fancy talk about global collaboration, and yet the countries that veto this, Germany is about 40% of German electricity is generated from coal. Of course, they're moving away from it, but the fact of the matter today is that that's what the situation is. A quarter of the US energy is generated from coal, and we are telling the poor Mozambicans, you can't use your coal, and less than 10% of their population has access to energy. So we find, as a multilateral development bank, we find ourselves in a very challenging situation that while we're trying to mobilize financing and mobilize instruments with a lot of success, when we actually take bankable projects to our board, some of which are financed in collaboration with Exim and others, we find this dichotomy. So hopefully we can get into a discussion about some of these political imperatives when it comes to financing development in the conversation. Thank you.
Mark, I think the previous session was a run-up to your area of study, which is financial regulations, because we are trying to do some work at Gateway House to describe and project how important financial regulations is in international relations. So why don't you tell us?
It's absolutely critical, and I should preface my remarks because I did think that the earlier panel, particularly the keynote, was a good setup, and I found myself agreeing with much, if not most of it. And so I do want to say, at the CATO Institute, we often find ourselves disagreeing with a lot of what's being put forward in Washington. So it's been interesting to me when I often hear the U.S. view. It's important to emphasize there's a fair amount of diversity within the U.S. view, as I suspect there is in most countries. And so I think we push back on a number of things, and I'm going to touch on some of those, but I do want to start with a little bit of a story. I remember about 2 years ago, I was at a conference in the U.S., and the topic was financial regulation. A well-known economist, I won't give his name because I'm not going to pick on him, started out his remarks with, well, why do we regulate finance? And he gave you all the stuff, you know, market failure was mentioned, asymmetric information, and it was mentioned, I really got my hands dirty on financial regulation working in our Senate on our banking committee for a number of years before the crisis, during the crisis. And I can say when I heard this well-known world-famous economists give me the reasons why we regulate finance, almost none of them rang true with my own personal experience in how we regulate finance on a day-to-day basis. And this is, of course, not to say that the economics are wrong. What it is to say is that there's a whole lot of other interests that intersect, such as diplomacy, which I'm going to talk about in a second, but there's also the politics. So for instance, one example, of course, is that if you as a financial institution want to clear any sort of dollar settlement in New York, you are going to be drafted into being an instrument of U.S. foreign policy, whether you want to or not. And that is a fact of in New York and the dominance of the dollar in financial markets to say, if you want to play in that game, and of course the threat is you get your license yanked and you can't clear dollars. I'll go as far to say it's the view of the U.S. Treasury Department, which I think is a bit extreme, that even were you and I to engage in a dollar transaction here, that because it is a dollar transaction, it is covered by U.S. law. And so I'm very sympathetic to the keynote remarks it made about the very expansive nature of the view in Washington that U.S. financial law essentially dominates the world. I think that that has a lot of downsides. I would emphasize, I think it has a lot of downsides for the U.S. as well. This isn't simply, I mean, again, the rest of the world has my sympathy, but I'll start with emphasizing, you know, as we know and we say in the U.S., we give everybody else pieces of paper and they give us nice stuff for it, which is a great advantage to us. But we threaten that advantage if we push people away from using dollars and we push toward other currencies. So I think ultimately, as we go over the next 20, 30 years and the reserve status of the dollar declines, quite frankly, I think the party most to blame for that will be the U.S. But let me also talk about a number of other issues. When we think about export financing, when we think about development financing, some of it is addressing market failures, but you also think about many of these institutions having come out of the post-World War II. When you think about things like the Marshall Plan, that financing was a very key element in the Cold War. So in course, building those relationships, I think those relationships are very important. I think we see that now in other institutions where whether it's China building relationships in Africa, whether it's India building relationships in Turkey, that some of these instances are trying to integrate these markets. And I think that's a very positive thing. So I will certainly note this is one of those issues where I would be remiss if I didn't recognize that in Washington there's a lot of skepticism about the development of alternative forms of financing that the multilateral institutions in Washington that to some extent are EU-US based view as competitors. Now, maybe it's my lens as economist, but I like competition. I like competition and choices. Of course, you have to recognize that when these institutions are tied to governments and there may be implied guarantees, if not explicit guarantees, and a lack of market discipline, that you have to be careful about the competition. So there's a balance. You also have to worry about, you know, sometimes these things blow it back in your face. I'll give you an example. You know, certainly we saw with the adoption of the euro and integration of the euro area, all of these capital flows from the north to the south. I think it's fair to say that at the end of the day, all this, say, French, German investment in Greece probably was in some sense a good thing, but it has not brought those countries closer together. It's been a point of conflict. And the reason I raise this is certainly a number of other institutions will see investments in some places not turn out well. And if it's a case where the populations in those countries feel like that they are having austerity imposed upon them to pay off foreign creditors, that will, if anything, undermine diplomatic objectives as well. So I only raise that to say there are pluses and minuses here. There's a balance you have to get right. I do fully agree with the comment about how we try to get past the market failure and how do we develop the private financing, because again, I think in some sense the diplomatic risk is less for that. But there are there. And I'll lastly say, sometimes we often see in these institutions a sense that because there is a public purpose that we can adopt lower standards for transparency, accountability. You know, again, just to say that I'll always start with using the U.S. as an example of what not to do sometimes. The perfect example to me is the institutions in our mortgage markets, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which some people may be aware of. We let them be massively leveraged with no capital. We looked the other way when they, fudged their books on their accounting, because of course we wanted everybody to be a homeowner. And I think it's important, and again, the objectives of all of these institutions are very noble, and you want to meet those objectives, but it's important also to make sure that there is accountability, that there's proper accounting standards, there's transparency to the public, because ultimately there is public money on the line. And I think you have to worry about, I tried to, the earlier moderator said we should forget about Sanders and Trump, and believe me, I've been trying for months to forget about them. But that said, we have to, the U.S. I don't think is alone in being this sort of anti-corporatist moment. And there's a lot of animosity around the world toward corporations. In some of the development lending, certainly in the U.S., and I think this is true elsewhere, feeds into this suspicion that these are just subsidies for Boeing to sell airplanes to other parts of the world. And I think you have to realize that. And so the last thing I would end with is you have to make sure that this development financing is done in a very fair, transparent way that doesn't benefit a small number of parties.
Thank you very much. Hans, how has economic diplomacy evolved over the years? You've been studying the impact of politics on economic diplomacy. What is the strategic imperative, and how are countries now adopting economic diplomacy?
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. My father's Indian. I've been coming here since I was a kid, and it's lovely to be back for a conference. I love this city, this maximum city, as it's been called, and it's lovely to come back for a conference here. So thank you to Gateway House and to the Government of India. I feel like slightly the odd man out on this panel because I'm not an economist or from a business or finance background. So what I'll try to do is talk about some of these issues around economic diplomacy from the sort of perspective of a foreign policy analyst. I guess it's the sort of Delhi perspective that Rajiv Bhatia talked about first thing this morning, because it strikes me that there is a disconnect between two conversations that happen around these issues, geoeconomics and economic diplomacy. And it's not just a disconnect between Delhi and Bombay. I think it goes deeper than that. And it's a disconnect between, on the one hand, economists who tend to think in win-win terms, and in particular about economic interdependence, and on the other hand, international relations theorists who tend to think, certainly realist international relations theorists who tend to think much more in zero-sum terms about these issues. And so I find that when I come to conferences like this one, or like much of this conference so far, where we're talking a lot about non-state actors and about the way that in an era of economic interdependence, there are really only win-win games now. And then you go to, and there's a kind of a presentism about this as well, the idea that actually things are completely different now than the way they used to be in the history of international relations. And then you go to foreign policy conferences. I know some people in the audience were at the Shangri-La conference a couple of weeks ago, and there, it's as if sometimes it seems as if international relations hasn't changed at all in the last 100 years, and that there are still very much these zero-sum games, you hear people talking slightly darkly about how Asia's future is going to resemble Europe's past. In other words, with a sort of shadow of great power war in the background. Now, I think the reality is a complex one that's somewhere between these two discussions that we have. International relations have changed, but perhaps not as much as some people think they have. International relations in Asia is different from the history of international relations between great powers in Europe, for example, but again, perhaps not quite so different as some people think. And it strikes me that this disconnect is particularly strong in Asia, actually, between these two different conversations. In 2012, two American analysts, Evan Feigenbaum and Robert Manning, wrote this influential article about two Asias, an economic Asia and a security Asia. And the economic Asia was the type of thing we've been hearing a lot about this morning, about economic integration and so on, as an engine of global growth and so on. And then you have a security Asia, which is focused much more around particularly the strategic rivalry between China and the United States, and potentially leads, as I said, to war. I think that what's happened in the last sort of 3 or 4 years since then is that these two Asias have kind of merged. That's my impression from looking at this from the outside, that what we now have is a situation in which you have both economic and military tools that are being used in a logic of competition. And so whether you look at, for example, TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership on the one hand, or China's geoeconomic initiatives like One Belt, One Road, you see the use of economic tools, but within this kind of logic of competition. And so that creates, I think, this very sort of difficult reality that we're struggling to get our heads around. But it strikes me that there is an important difference here that hasn't really come up so far between, on the one hand, I mean, we've talked a lot about sort of Western, non-Western powers, developed countries, developing countries, that fault line, which is obviously very real. But it seems to me there is another fault line which hasn't come up so far, which is basically between authoritarian powers on the one hand and democracies with open economies on the other hand. And it's not a black and white distinction, but it does seem to me that that authoritarian powers, and I'm thinking particularly here of China, have a different set of economic resources that the state controls. Sovereign wealth funds, state-owned enterprises, and so on. As I say, it's not black and white. Norway has a sovereign wealth fund, but it does seem to me, basically, that there is a difference there, which limits the options that that Western powers on the one hand, but also a country like India, it seems to me, has in terms of responding to China's geoeconomic initiatives. And it seems to me these do create a real dilemma for countries that that tend to think, for example, about investment, to come back to the core question of strategic finance in a different way, and particularly in a commercial way. I think this does raise a really difficult dilemma when it's at least possible that some of the investment that authoritarian powers, China and Gulf states as well, are undertaking are not for commercial reasons. They are actually for strategic reasons. They'll alter the balance of power, particularly in Asia. And I think there are real questions about how we respond to that.
Thank you very much. I think, David, I'd like you to come in here. Is it possible for us, for India, to compete with the economic heft and their ability to give the kind of concessional loans they give, 10-year cost of capital, or etc.? Is it possible for us to do, for Indian Exim Bank to do?
The answer is yes and no. If you just take a look at numbers, the combined balance sheet of the China Development Bank and the Exim Bank of China approximates the GDP of India. So if you're looking at a direct head-to-head competition, you're not in the same room, you're not in the same building, you're probably not even in the same city. But having said that, the answer is to compete intelligently. There is no point adopting a kind of a shotgun approach and going head-to-head on every single issue. We need to identify that this is our core interest in terms of a sector, this is our core interest in terms of a geographic area, and focus our resources on that. You could almost call it a military approach. What do I mean? We have suggested in Africa, for example, in the annual meeting of the African Development Bank in Lusaka just last month, when Kapil was there, our chairman was also there. We've been trying to encourage with the government of India an approach targeting the healthcare sector, for example. If you look at statistics in Africa, to take an example, the external support to African healthcare is way more than that in all the rest of the world. which gives you an indication of the kind of resources needed for healthcare in Africa. The impact of poor healthcare or the absence of healthcare on development has already been established. I don't need to talk about that. If we could look at setting up, let's say, a hospital network, tertiary hospitals in about 7 or 8 parts of Africa, which are reasonably well connected, you're going to address a significant part of the traffic which currently comes to India for medical tourism. And part of that funds would stay in Africa rather than coming to India. I'm not suggesting you close medical tourism. That's never going to happen. But at least the more common ailments would be tackled in that area. Now, in that area, you are going head to head, and you can win because you have the advantage of focusing in that particular area. The alternative is to, let me save that for a later question. I think you have other panelists here.
Well, I just wanted to pose a similar question to you, Dr. Cham, that, you know, in many ways, Turkey is similar. Drawing comparisons is always very risky, but there are many challenges in that region, Turkey right now, geopolitical conflict, migration, refugees, and as you'd mentioned before, Turkey is not as rich a nation as some of the other countries in the world. So how does Turkey then gather the resources to do what it needs to do? China is trying to convert this aid-based approach, it seems, to a more commercial approach. But you said humanitarian goals have to take primacy. So how do you manage that? How do you reconcile the two?
Of course, if you have the stability, political stability, and the reflection to the economy, you will be able to do something for others. If you do not have any kind of budgets and any kind of economic stability, it's not possible to do it. So, thanks to the government's stability, since more than governing 15 years in a stability, we have many booming developments in Turkey. So we are using the extras, the advantages for the others. This is one case. The other point is that if you do too much work on the table and not go to the ground, and you just concentrate on the visibility or to do something for gaining something, then you will never gain, because aid organizations, assistance to the other countries is not a kind of toolkit for marketing, not opening a new market or for exports or investments or political advantages. These are, as I've mentioned before, has to be in a point of discussion for many countries. The world is now in a different era. Everybody is very clever, everybody is very intelligent, everybody is educated. You cannot make lies. You will look to the eyes of the people who need something, and you share your values. I would like to give a very small example, what we have done in Somalia case. In year 2011, our president, on that time he was the prime minister, has taken 3 full load of planes to Somalia, to Mogadishu, which was very dangerous, and it was very difficult to go there. I even couldn't find a plane to go before his visit, and we have hired a Russian plane to go there because no one did not accepted the insurance part of the flight and so on. And we have visited with different people from ministers, the families, MPs, NGOs, business people, and many people from film area and so on. Then he came back to Turkey and made a campaign. And in 1 month, it was the holy Ramadan time. In 1 month, everybody has sent messages and sent money to the fund. And not only the rich people, but the poor people. And they said that this dinner, I would use my dinner, and I'm going to send messages with my mobile. So on those days, a message was costing about $2 approximately as a contribution to the budget. So it was collected $300 million. So it was a very important issue in terms of ODA system or assistance system. If you make necessary planning, if you use your assets, it is always possible to share some parts. But the issue is not, the people are not ready to share their extras. Same for LDCs. There are millions of people who are ready to be happy and to survive with the extras of many rich countries. if you are using too much luxuries and if you do not want to make some concessions, you will never manage to have the budget. So the difficulty is that the rich ones are not trying to give to others. The taxation system is saying again, in the parliaments, many countries, people are complaining about the government, saying that I am sending my tax for my own luxuries, and why you are sending this money to out abroad. So if this is the question, you will never be successful to find an extra amount for sharing with others. If the world can sit and decide, there are enough capacity to overcome all the problems in the world, because the assets are there. The world's richest continent is Africa. They don't need anything from the outside. They just need a startup budget. They need a startup system. So if you use them for themselves, not for your country or for yourself or for company, then it is possible. But when you go to the African countries, I would like to give, last week I was there, you see many modern technologies there, many instruments, 4G systems, everybody is using mobiles. On the highways, the new model of cars are imported there. So everybody is pumping money to just sell and to gain more there. So this wouldn't never make them to develop and overcome their problems.
Actually, it's a perfect, Mark, can you just hold 1 second? I wanted to pose this question to Kapil because he spoke about Africa as an example, and you worked on something called Africa 50, which is a Pan-Africa infrastructure fund. I don't know if you call it like a sovereign, but it's like a mega sovereign wealth fund in a way, but explain how that process was and what's the importance of something like that.
I mean, the question that we're all battling with collectively is how do we leverage our balance sheets? You know, if you look at all the multilateral development banks, the investment needs are so great that our balance sheets are not big enough. And yet we know that there's money sitting out there. You know, you mentioned 5 trillion in sovereign wealth funds. It's actually gone up to 7 trillion as we speak, right? Pension funds are sitting on about $35 trillion. All of these are looking for long-term investments. And so when we created the Africa 50 Fund, the idea was, how do we create an instrument outside of the balance sheet of a multilateral development bank, but at the same time provide comfort to investors coming in that a multilateral bank will have skin in the game? Because what happens is that when we invest in infrastructure projects, governments take that investment much more seriously. So the idea is, let's take a small amount of money from our balance sheet, put it in a road project or an energy project, but then get instruments like Africa 50, which have shareholding from countries, but possibly now we're working on these sovereign wealth funds and the pension funds so that they can bring in their capital.
So not just African countries.
So not just Africa, it's just global, all over, investors all over. What our engagement does is buys a certain amount of policy certainty. What our engagement does is buy a certain amount of predictability. And what it does is reduces the risk that investors perceive of investing in African economies. The fact of the matter, although, is that there are studies that have been done on African infrastructure going back 15 to 20 years to say it's actually a myth. The risk perception is largely that. It's a perception. Very few of the so-called investors have burned, I mean, there have been some projects which have gone under, but by and large, the returns to African infrastructure are 15, 16, 17%. Now, you tell a pension fund manager that you can get over a 10, 15-year period sustained returns, why would they invest anywhere else? So when you mentioned Africa 50, instruments like that are being created, not just by us, but by the Asian Development Bank and by others, to try and crowd in that private finance, to see how we can then leverage our balance sheets. I think that's the name of the game going forward.
I think there are actually some pension fund managers here, so maybe you guys can talk later. And if something happens, make sure you give Gateway House a fee. Mark, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I was going to mention that I do think part of the conversation needs to be whether financing in the form of debt is the right solution in that alternative. So the way I think about it is kind of 3 buckets. There are a number of alternatives, especially on the humanitarian aid side, where in my opinion grants are probably the better way to go. Of course, I could say a loan that doesn't get repaid is a grant. But that said, on the lending side, but it's also important to keep in mind the difference between debt and equity financing. In a lot of instances, to me, the equity financing make a lot more sense where there's a lot of risk to it. And of course, I think Kapil mentioned earlier the weather development derivatives and other financial instruments that may hedge risk as well. But again, I just want to emphasize that we often look at this as a loan is the way to go when there really should be a variety of instruments on the table. And I worry that sometimes, certainly in the US, we've often preferred loans because the cost of such is less transparent than the cost of a grant or equity.
Well, while we're on the subject of the instruments themselves, David, maybe you can help explain, Exim is popularly known at least for their line of credit, but there are many other kinds of instruments that you're using now, including helping corporates invest abroad. And you've done project support, Riyadh Airport, is that right? Metro? And then you have lines of credit in rail in Sri Lanka and many others such. So what is the effectiveness? How are you choosing the correct instrument for your purpose?
That's the dilemma actually, and it follows from what Mark just said. I fully agree, especially if you're looking at development finance. The grant is probably the way to go, or perhaps a higher grant element is the way to go in an ideal world. But the problem is, well, we don't live in an ideal world. It's very difficult to get a political consensus or a social consensus for grant financing when in India you have more poor people than the whole of, let's say, Africa put together. So one has to go with the art of the possible, which is what politics is all about. Yes, we've done financing under lines of credit. You mentioned the Riyadh Metro. That was more by way of a commercial guarantee support. And I'm happy to have done it. It was done by Larsen & Toubro, the largest single project export ever secured by India. But if you ask me, we got a lot more satisfaction for doing some of the development projects. There is a hydropower project in Rwanda, for example, a dam on the Nyabarongo River, which is contributing just 28 megawatts of power. But 28 megawatts of power in Rwanda is probably 25% of that country's entire power requirement. Now, we've been there. I've been to that dam personally, landed at the spot, and you see in that area a large number of children. If you look at our annual report, you'll see some photographs of there. Children about this height who have never seen an electric light in their lives. For them, their day starts with the sunrise and ends at sunset, barring a few candles. Those kids can now go to school because they can study by electric light in the evenings, and that is going to lead in turn to I would say a transformation of activity. To my mind, no offense, but that's much more important than the Riyadh Metro project. But coming back to the instrument itself, what we really need to foster is investment. A similar project which I could mention on a much higher scale in Ethiopia, where we have financed an Indian business group in setting up a denim plant. You'll ask me why denim? Who in Ethiopia is going around wearing jeans? But the point is, they are using cotton grown in Africa. Western Africa is a source of some very high quality cotton, and much of it is organic cotton. Now this plant in Ethiopia is going to use African grown cotton to spin the yarn out of that. It's going to dye it into denim. It's not reached the stage of making jeans yet. That's still perhaps 5 years into the future because the skills are not there. But because it is based in Africa, it is using Indian expertise, but it is using African-grown cotton. It's getting duty-free preferences and admission into the developed markets. Now, this is where you can have a win-win situation where you are using debt, probably commercial debt, but you're also using the conditions in that country and in the source country to get a win-win package for all. Is it ideal? No. Is it practical? Probably yes.
Am I out of time? Did they just cut me? I think they just cut me out. Okay. Maybe what I wanted to ask you is, I think there are other instruments. While we're still on the topic of instruments, I think, at least in India, very few people know about, say, the capital markets, the support to capital markets that African Development Bank is doing. Because traditionally, development finance is again known for maybe giving concession loans or building, doing a lot of humanitarian work. But what does that mean to help support capital market development? 4 regional exchanges being connected to each other? What does that mean?
I mean, again, all of this is driven by the motivation to say, how do we mobilize finance for development purposes. African capital markets are in their infancy, bar a few. If you look at maybe just the South African market or the Nigerian market, the two of them probably account for 75% of Africa's capital markets. And so with the view to developing long-term finance, we've been providing support for the development of the domestic bond market. We've been providing support to local securities and exchange commissions. We've been trying to get all of these exchanges to talk to one another, to get uniform standards, automation. But the fact of the matter is that over the next decade, despite our best efforts at doing this, the scale of financing will not be what we would like to see it to meet these financing needs. So yes, we launch bonds in the local market. We've done bonds in Tanzanian shillings, in South African rand, and so forth, and we use those to make local payments. But the real needs are significantly larger than the capacity of local financial systems. And so we're now looking at ways in which we can try and mobilize global finance and say, we would like to come in and let's look at the mix of instruments. So it doesn't have to be debt. But there is a small role for debt. I mean, one of the biggest challenges we face is the pipeline of bankable projects. And money is seldom available for project preparation. So the question is, how, if you go to an investor and ask for money for project preparation, you're going to get laughed out of town. So there is a natural role. There is a role for debt at certain stages of the project cycle, particularly for project preparation. Once the project reaches a certain stage and reaches bankability, that's when you can try and attract investors outside to try and say, okay, now you take it over and take it to the next stage. So we are looking at a combination of things. At what stage in the project cycle should we make use of debt instruments? When does equity make most sense? When do we try and bring in investors from outside? What is the role of domestic capital markets? But I just also want to go back to a point that was made earlier. It is not about just competition with China, and I hear that all the time. The fact of the matter is that there is a lot of areas in which India has a comparative advantage, and that's what you can try and exploit. One initiative that we've launched is a Jobs for Youth in Africa initiative. Africa creates only about 3 million jobs a year, needs to create 11 million jobs a year. Now, there's a gap of 8 million jobs. Now, India has a comparative advantage in trying to develop the skills which will provide the kind of, the quality of people that the African markets are looking for. So I think that's an area. Africa is a net importer of food, despite the fact that it has the world's largest supply of arable land. The history of the Green Revolution in this country is something that Africans would love to learn from. So take advantage of the various opportunities that exist, but don't always think in terms of the competition part of it, because there's plenty of business to go around.
Okay, fair enough. Mark, $50 trillion that are sitting somewhere around the world in investable finance, but we don't have the regulation or the right rating methodologies maybe to... Oh, I said something so important, nobody heard it? $50 trillion worth of assets and capital sitting around the world, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, but still, G20 has been discussing channeling long-term savings into infrastructure forever. But rating agencies, rating methodologies, regulations still not supporting it. How do we get that money?
Well, this does go back to, I guess at the beginning I was somewhat dismissive of the typical economic explanation, but as we economists would say, asymmetric information, or that lack of information, does actually matter in many contexts. And I think it gets to the point that Kapoor is making about the capacity building. So for instance, we know in a number of countries that there simply is not a credit background for the individual. And so we spent decades in the US, of course, creating credit rating agencies, both for corporations as well as individuals. So I think something like 80% of the American public has a FICO score. And I think most of them are happy with it. Of course, a number are not. But the point being is you have something where you can rate and you can take that risk and you can develop a model. How do you reproduce that? And I actually think this is where digital technology is going to come in. When the US developed its model of essentially trying to rate individuals, I mean, this was in a paper world where you didn't have the digital technology and the rating agencies had to go down to courthouses and copy records and judgments and all sorts of things. So in a sense, you can leapfrog that, hopefully. But again, trying to develop that information. I will also emphasize that I think a really big important part of this that we forget sometimes is the basic legal structure really does matter a very big deal. To some extent, if somebody doesn't feel like that their investment can be enforced if it goes wrong, or that they can repossess assets or collateral, I think you're not going to see that private investment there. So a structure where contracts are widely understood, enforced, you can have disagreements arbitrated, a functioning court system. To me, those are the foundations. And of course, as mentioned, functioning security exchanges, for instance, these are all crucially important if you want the money to be invested there. I was actually just saying to somebody earlier today how kind of depressing it is someone in the US looking at that, and I guess put it this way, as an economist, I get asked by my friends all the time where they should put their money. And I'm like, well, the stock market doesn't look that good, and the bond market doesn't look that good, and I think real estate's getting overpriced. It's like nowhere. So the point being is, I actually think there are, there's demand for investment in these areas if there's a safety and security. And again, I think this is where the state-sponsored financing could come in. Ultimately, and I think this was touched on earlier, you want to transition away from a world where the private financing takes over, but in the interim, you can try to substitute for that lack of security, but you've got to make sure that the end game is that you're building that legal infrastructure.
Thank you. And maybe, Hans, I'd like to end at least this round of discussions with you. I think it's important to discuss these details, institutions and instruments of economic diplomacy. But in the end, it is there is a factor of politics here, of strategy here, right? You've studied Germany and Europe, even the United States, I believe, but what have some of the other countries done? Like, what is Germany playing such a central role today, not in development finance, but generally as an economic power in Europe and around the world? So what is the role of geopolitics?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of us in Europe are capital flows. And that's had some negative consequences. And one of the things that it's done, as Mark suggested, has been to open up some kind of old wounds in Europe that actually economic interdependence was meant to overcome. I think that actually offers some interesting, I mean, difficult, but interesting lessons for Asia. And then secondly, I suppose I would say that in terms of this question of strategic finance that we're looking at, I suppose another sort of problematic aspect, I think, of what's happened in Europe in general and in terms of Germany's role specifically that's now become clear, is that actually, I mean, first of all, that the European single currency increased this divergence and the economic imbalances between European countries, and so it created these surpluses and conversely also obviously deficits. But those surpluses actually weren't invested smartly. So, for example, I mean, in a sense, in answer to your question about Germany, I think Germany hasn't really been a very good example of strategic finance. And some people actually now do argue that Germany needs a sovereign wealth fund precisely because part of what happened, I think, was that the German surplus was recycled into subprime in the United States, into some pretty problematic investments in the European periphery, and now Germany's in danger of losing actually some of that investment. So overall, I would say there are some lessons, but they're sort of negative lessons rather than positive lessons for others to follow.
I did not want to end on a negative note, but I heard the two bells, which is a warning bell, asking me to go to Q&A. So, Elvira, do we have questions?
We do indeed. There's quite a handful. So the first question comes from Sanja Iyer of TISS here in Mumbai, which is, though we're discussing aid and development financing, we have not spoken about civil society participation in that. So the question is whether you can spend a few minutes with your perspectives on that. And if I may be so bold, I'll add another consideration, which is what about the many large private foundations that are also acting in this space? Is there anything that you'd like to reflect on in terms of their role?
Dr. Chamburi.
Of course, the contribution of private foundations, private organizations are very important, because the contribution of the governments are only negligible and symbolically. So as I said previously, it has to be as a startup position. So one thing I would like to give is, would like to give is a Somalia case. We as government, we have spent more than $500 million for recovery and increasing the stability and the capacity of the government of Somalia. Then some companies came to there to run the business in the port. And the important thing is that in one part we are increasing the capacity of the recipient countries' capacity. The other part, the economy is running and increasing by this contribution of the private sector. So with the increase of the capacity of the tax collection, the Turkish private company who was running the business of the port administration has managed to bring approximately the 50% of the income of the Somali government. So this is important, that you have to make a certain basis for private organizations to go and to run the economy effectively.
Okay. Next question.
Okay. We have another question about Africa, or indeed, sorry, I should jump first it's actually about Turkey, forgive me. You put so eloquently at the start, Dr. Cham, again for you, the ethos of your agency. And there's a question from Bozkurt Aran to elaborate a bit more about the volume of your agency's aid, which is provided to developing countries, including and especially in Africa.
As Turkey, we have last year, in year 2015, has managed to contribute more than $4 billion for ODA, for as assistance to other countries. And we have opened many embassies and many TİKA offices in Africa. Now we have 39 embassies in African countries and 18 TİKA offices there. And we are trying to manage and develop projects in yearly basis, more than 2,000 projects in all over the world, including Latin America and Pacific region and Caribbean region. But besides all over these activities, we are also trying to concentrate on the local problems which is arising in Syria and Iraq and many other problems surrounding, including the Black Sea region, Ukraine, and many problems. So all these problems are indirectly or directly affecting Turkey, but each time we are increasing our capacity and ability. The crises are not always bringing problems, but sometimes it's always sometimes it also brings extra advantages, capacities to increase your strength. But for this question, I would like to also again mention that what happens in Africa or in the Middle East or in other countries, no country should not say that it's very far away from me, thousands of kilometers away. If I do not take care too much about, I do not want to bother. But it would be somehow going to affect either with a terror problem or economical problem or another case. Therefore, what happens in the world, it is important for every country, and the world is in one point. Okay.
Thank you. There's a question for Kapil Kapoor here, which is about the transformation of African economies, the rise of the middle class, and a question about how that has, in fact, affected the ways in which your organization is working, whether it's changed priorities or made you consider different ways of doing the work. And perhaps others could reflect on similar developments in other regions as well.
Well, I mean, the continent's going through a massive transformation quite rapidly. I mean, you have a middle class right now that has a purchasing power annually of about $2 trillion a year. and an urbanization rate which is about 50–60%. In a few years' time, 60% of Africa's population will live in its cities. So obviously, we are thinking about urban infrastructure, access to energy, access to roads, access to safe drinking water. And all of this comes back to that same question about the financing available for infrastructure purposes. And I think for me, that is critical. And I mean, I think for us, the single biggest priority for the continent is access to energy. I just want to go back to this question on civil society, and I want to be provocative intentionally. Last month we had a meeting, our annual meetings were in Lusaka, Zambia, and for 2 whole days there was a side meeting taking place with civil society organizations. And we were very roundly criticized by civil society organizations for even contemplating the use, and I go back to the energy sector, the use of coal for generating electricity. And it turns out that, you know, bulk of these quote-unquote civil society organizations are financed by countries who also tend to have veto power on the multilateral development bank boards. And the question I asked some civil society organizations was, who are you representing? If Africa only has the capacity to create 3 million jobs, are you representing the interests of those 8 million young unemployed who enter the markets every year? How can you expect to create jobs for such people if you do not have access to energy? You talked about, you know, the only lights people see are the sunrise in the morning and the sunset at night. Think about no electricity to run workshops, no electricity to run factories, etc. And we are talking about the need to create jobs. So sometimes I question, quote unquote, our conversations with civil society, because I do not think many civil society organizations, and I'm being very intentionally provocative here, whose interests are they representing?
You want to add to that?
Let me say, I think this is so incredibly important here, and I'll give you a couple examples. I mean, not only on the energy side, but for instance, so we heard earlier from one of our morning keynote about sort of derivatives trading and how this would impact here. And certainly I mentioned earlier the money laundering. And so if you in Washington bring up these issues, whether it's the money laundering or derivatives or whether it's the energy, the reaction you get is not, well, you know, okay, we should be concerned about the rest of the world. The reaction you get is, well, you know, you're just a front for the big banks. And I think it's incredibly important for those of us who are trying to make these arguments within Washington and moving the conversation toward actually being concerned about what's happening in the rest of the world, that the rest of that conversation enters into that. So I think that that's an incredibly important aspect with it. And I want to pivot to a different question real quick on Africa. And correct me if I'm wrong on this, but certainly my reflection of one of the most important developments there, to go back to financial regulation, is the growth of M-Pesa and the payment system you have there. And I actually use this example all the time in America because you couldn't do M-Pesa in America. The regulatory structure would prohibit it because, of course, M-Pesa is developed by a phone company, not a bank. And I do think we have to make sure in many of these countries that we don't. So, for instance, if much of Africa had the U.S. financial regulatory system, you never would have had M-Pesa. So getting your regulatory structure right at the beginning is incredibly important.
We're out of time?
I believe so.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank the panelists and the speakers for this session. Please, can we have a round of applause for the speakers? Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. Thank you, moderator. And with that, it's a wrap on the panel on strategic financing for effective economic diplomacy.